Hello friends, once again you all are welcome in my YouTube channel. So friends, the topic that I have chosen for this video is poetic trends in 17th century and metaphysical poetry. So in the first part of my video, first I will talk about historical background of the period, then various poetic trends in 17th century, then I will discuss metaphysical term and its representative poet. And in the final part of my video, my focus on its characteristics and its impact on modern poetry. So friends, let us begin. The period from 1625 to 1649 is known as Caroline Age, the age of Charles I. It was the age of English and Scottish history. The term Caroline is derived from Carolus, the Latin for Charles, as Jacobean for James. So before discussing some other things, you should know about the division of the period. So I start with Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth ruled from 1558 to 1603, and the period was known as Elizabethan period after her name. Then from 1603 to 1625, King James I ruled, and the period was known as Jacobean age. And from 1625 to 1649, it was the reign of Charles I, Caroline age. And from 1642 to 1651, it was the period of Civil War, and the Civil War was in its climax at that time. And from 1642 to 1660, this period was known as a Commonwealth period or the Great Interregnum. And after that, from 1660 to 1685, this was the period of Charles II, Restoration period. The Caroline age was dominated by the growing religious, political and social discord between king and the supporters of the parliament. The supporters of the kings were known as the royalist or cavalier, which included the court, the church, the Catholics and the wealthy people of the north. The supporters of the parliament were known as the Roundhead, which included the Puritan, the workers, the merchants and the middle class in general. After the execution of Charles I in 1649, the country was declared Commonwealth or Republic. And all the power was centered to Oliver Cromwell, a leading general of parliamentary forces in Civil War, who became Lord Protector of England, Scotland and Ireland. After the death of Cromwell in 1658, his son Richard became the ruler for 2 years. But political crisis increased and Parliament has to restore monarchy and invited Charles II, the son of late king, as his ruler in 1660. Caroline age was the age of three kinds of poetry: metaphysical poetry, cavalier poetry and Puritan poetry. Metaphysical poetry was headed by John Donne. Donne, who founded Tribe of Donne. Tribe of Donne means followers of John Donne, which included George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Thomas Otway, Andrew Marvell, Sir John Cleveland and Abraham Cowley. Cavalier poetry was headed by Ben Jonson. Jonson founded Tribe of Ben, means followers of Ben Jonson. And most of the followers of Ben Jonson were courtly poets except Robert Herrick. So Robert Herrick, Thomas Carew, Richard Lovelace and John Suckling. These were the Cavalier poets. And they wrote mostly on Carpe Diem theme. Carpe Diem is a Latin term coined by Horace, which means do not miss opportunity, seize the day. So most of the Cavalier poets, they wrote on the theme of invitation. They wrote invitational lyrics. They wrote carpe diem themes in the manner of Ben Jonson's lyric. Then we have the Puritan poetry. Puritan poetry was written by John Milton, Bunyan, and one more writer who is common in metaphysical poetry also, Andrew Marvell. The term metaphysical applied to a group of 17th century poets like John Donne, Henry Vaughan, Richard Crashaw, Sir John Cleveland, Abraham Cowley, and Andrew Marvell. The term first used by William Drummond of Hawthornden in a letter to Arthur Johnston in 1630. Later, Dryden has used the term metaphysics in his Discourse of the Original and Progress of Satire in 1692 when he said about Donne, he affects the metaphysics not only his satires but in his amorous verses, where nature only should range and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculation of philosophy. Dr. Johnson, in his Lives of Poets in 1779, established the term metaphysical. He borrowed the term metaphysical from Dryden's phrase about Donne, Donne affect metaphysics. Dr. Johnson, in his Life of Cowley, has declared that about the beginning of the 17th century, there appeared a race of writers that may be termed as a metaphysical poet. So, it was Dr. Johnson who first applied the term metaphysical for poetry. So, before 1779, no one had spoken about race of metaphysical poets, which Johnson chiefly consisted Cowley, Cleveland, and John Donne. Dr. Johnson described Abraham Cowley, the last of his race and undoubtedly the best. But when Dr. Johnson was talking about metaphysical, he did not mean to praise them. Instead, he leveled many charges against them. And one such charge was when he said, metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show learning was their whole endeavor. Metaphysical poetry came as a conscious poetic reaction against Petrarchan, Italian, Spenserian branch type of poetry, and made tough, masculine, and strong-lined. So another name of metaphysical poetry is strong-lined verse poetry. As Elizabethans, they were fond of pun and wordplay. They played with words. Metaphysical poets played with thoughts. So friends, now let us discuss some characteristics of metaphysical poetry. The first characteristics of metaphysical poetry is far-fetched imagery or peculiar use of imagery. Far-fetched imagery means the poet ransacks all field of knowledge, science as well as nature. They borrowed imageries from different sources of information, from different sources of knowledge like astrology, astronomy, and emblem books. Then we have metaphysical conceit. Metaphysical conceit means the juxtaposition of images and comparison with two very dissimilar objects. And Donne, he was the champion of metaphysical conceit when he compares the soul of two lovers with compass. In a valediction forbidding morning, when Donne says, if they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. And this was the brilliant example of metaphysical conceit. Then we have some other characteristics like wit, novel of ideas, For novel of ideas, Dr. Johnson's words, metaphysical poets hoped had been never said before. Then we have dexterous use of speech, complex theme, love for paradox, metaphysical shudder. Metaphysical shudder means poet gave a sense of astonishment sometime in between the poem and sometime at the end of the poem. Then we have dialectical argument. Dialectical argument means poem is based on triadic structure, that is thesis, antithesis and synthesis. Andrew marvels to his coy mistress, this poem is based on dialectical argument. If, but, then. And we also find dialectical argument in Pindari code, strophe, antistrophe and epode. Then we have direct method, elliptical thought, intellectual robustness. Intellectual robustness means all are metaphysical poet, they are intellectual and men of learning. Then we have unification of sensibility. Unification of sensibility means fusion of thought and feeling. What they thought, they felt, and what they felt, they thought. T.S. Eliot, during the 20th century, in his critical essay, Metaphysical Poets, he admired this quality of metaphysical poetry. Then we have dramatic realism, exaggeration and obscurity. Obscurity, this feature is also shared by modern poetry. And we also find obscurity in the poetry of Robert Browning. And because of this, Browning was famous as a Victorian Dun. Because of the obscurity, Hopkins' poetry becomes the Hopkins disease. And in T.S. Eliot, we also find obscurity. But T.S. Eliot defended the obscurity of modern poetry and metaphysical poetry in his critical essays. And he said, obscurity because of the complex reality of the modern age. So poet has to use obscurity in order to depict out the reality which is below the surface. So friends, these are the characteristics of the metaphysical poetry. Hope you enjoyed, enlightened and got the insight of my lecture. So bye bye everyone, take care and have a great day.